Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I am Jessica Kim Cohen with Becker's Healthcare. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We are looking forward to hearing your questions. We also will have some quiz questions throughout the webinar. You'll be able to select your answer by clicking on the screen. Additionally, in about a week following the webinar, we will be sending you a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. At this time, it is now my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our presenters. Prior to joining Olive, Rebecca Hellman served as the Vice President of Marketing for Cardinal Health's Hospital Solutions and Global Supply Chain Division. In this capacity, she was a member of the Acquisition and Integration Team for an RFID, a data-enabled technology offering for operating rooms and catheterization labs, and introduced an end-to-end lead generation and management program. Rebecca also spent 8 years at MedPlus, the healthcare IT subsidiary of Quest Diagnostics, serving as the Vice President of Marketing, where she built and led all product and services marketing activities across hospital and physician markets in support of Care 360 EHR and ChartMax document management and imaging. Earlier in her career, Rebecca gained experience as a business strategy consultant with roles at Accenture and Metametrics, a boutique healthcare consulting agency. Rebecca holds a bachelor's degree from Notre Dame and an MBA from The Ohio State University Fisher College of Business. David Landerman, Senior Director of Engineering at Olive, started his career by spending several years in higher education, healthcare information technology. During this time, he got to experience some of the unique challenges in supporting a healthcare IT environment. He left healthcare for a few years and led the evolution of digital presence for a major media company, supporting the web and mobile presence for television stations, radio, and newspapers. After meeting Sean Lane, CEO of Olive, in 2013, David decided to return to the healthcare space with the desire to use his skills and expertise to further Sean's vision of transforming healthcare. From growing Olive's machine learning capabilities to building a robotic process automation platform consumable across the healthcare space, David is excited to continue having a transformative impact on healthcare. Rebecca, I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for those kind words of introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Optimizing the Revenue Cycle Using Artificial Intelligence. As I said, my name is Rebecca Hellman, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Olive. Olive is a healthcare automation and artificial intelligence company. We help healthcare organizations automate their repetitive and high-volume tasks, many of which are found in the revenue cycle function. You may be familiar with Crosschex. Crosschex has been around for more than 5 years in the patient identity arena. It was only 18 months ago that we introduced Olive, our AI as a service solution, to the marketplace. Since her inception, more than 40 organizations have hired her to give bandwidth to their short staff, offload some of their more laborious tasks, and generally help them more tactically and strategically adjust their organizations for the future. Last month, we announced that Crosschex would be rebranding its company name to Olive as a tangible illustration of our singular commitment to bringing an AI workforce to healthcare. Today, our mission stays the same: to carve $1 trillion out of the cost of healthcare and increase the quantity and quality of human life. We know it's an audacious goal, but for all of us that operate within healthcare, we know healthcare requires audacious thinking. We're appreciative of your decision to spend some time with us today. There's a lot of mystique around artificial intelligence, and our goal today is to provide you with some grounding information on what it is, how it works, and why it can be valuable. I'm joined here today by my colleague David, Olive's Senior Director of Engineering, and I'll turn it over to him.
Hi, everyone. Like Rebecca mentioned, my name is David Landerman, and I'm the Senior Director of Engineering here at Olive. In this role, I lead the team that is building the Olive platform. The Olive platform really is the core of Olive and what enables us to teach Olive and oversee the work that she's doing. So the purpose of today's webinar is to talk through what artificial intelligence in the realm of automation means, and what are some of the types of automation that could benefit your organization. From there, we'll talk through some of the strategies to help you identify good candidates for automation and then we'll expand on those strategies to help you determine return on investment from your strategy. We've got about an hour together this afternoon, so we'll talk through the content I just described, and from there we'll open up the floor to questions. If you have any questions that come up before the Q&A period, you can email them to us at olive@oliveai.com or post them in the chat tab on the GoToWebinar dashboard. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. So our topic today is optimizing your revenue cycle using artificial intelligence. So in order to solve for that, we need to start by asking the very simple question, what is artificial intelligence? So artificial intelligence techniques are used for several types of automation, which we'll dive into more in a bit, but on a macro level, you can think of about automations in two distinctly different buckets. There's rule-based and judgment-based. Artificial intelligence techniques fall into the judgment-based automation category, but first let's start with looking at what rules-based automations are. Rule-based automations are process-driven, meaning they should be completed the same way every time based on certain parameters and triggers. An example of this might be copying patient data from an EMR and pasting it into an Excel document. Even though each patient will have different information, a rules-based automation effectively knows which information to copy and paste into Excel. Rules-based automations are coded to recognize certain triggers and to perform the same way based on those triggers every time. This is one reason that rules-based automations can be simpler to implement into an organization's workflow. The algorithms are trained on trigger-based logic so they can mimic the way an employee would go about that same task. Rule-based automations are often applied to organizational workflows using robotic process automation, otherwise known as RPA. RPA involves the training and implementation of software that executes on repetitive, high-volume tasks. At Olive, one of the workflows we commonly implement with robotic process automation is eligibility checking. A typical eligibility workflow with Olive starts by first accessing the list of scheduled patients for a specific date. Then, each patient's insurance information is copied and pasted into the appropriate insurance portal. From there, Olive logs into the insurance portal to check the patient's eligibility status. Finally, she'll write the eligibility status back to the EMR or any other repository the healthcare organization prefers. This is a good task for RPA to take over since it only requires copying and pasting of data, simple mouse clicks, and interactions with specific predetermined websites and native applications. For many of our organizations using Olive for RPA-only eligibility, Olive posts an approved determination back to the EMR and flags any denied determinations for potential further employee intervention. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, we're talking about a kind of judgment-based automation. These automations are a little less straightforward than rule-based automation in that they will change based on the context they are run in. As these algorithms get more information, they effectively learn right from wrong in order to run more self-sufficiently over time. Before we dive in, I do want to mention this is probably the most technical portion of our webinar. If not all of the content is sticking, that's okay, but the point is to run through how the technology works so that you have a better understanding of how you can apply it to the business cases that are impacting your organization. Artificial intelligence allows for the creation of judgment-based automation. It can take on several different approaches, such as machine learning, computer vision, and entity extraction. We'll talk through each of these momentarily, but first, let's go ahead and define artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence, also commonly known as AI, is a bucket term that is used to describe algorithms that can effectively understand data just like a human would, then interact with that data in predefined ways. Machine learning and computer vision are two examples of AI techniques, which we'll dive into now. So machine learning, also known as ML, is a type of AI that allows software applications to become more accurate in predicting outcomes without being explicitly programmed by a developer. The basic premise of machine learning is to build algorithms that can receive input data and use statistical analysis on historical data to help predict an output value within some acceptable range. One of the most common barriers we hear about when we talk about machine learning to clients and organizations is that it needs to be clean historical data in order to learn right from wrong. And since a lot of organizations don't have the cleanest data, they feel like ML is inaccessible to them. However, just because your organization doesn't have clean data doesn't mean that you can't still benefit from machine learning. The reason why is because there are actually two different approaches to machine learning. There's both supervised and unsupervised learning. Supervised algorithms, which are the more common class, require humans to provide both input and the expected output given that input. Once training is complete, the algorithm can effectively apply what was learned to the new data it has never seen before. But if an organization is concerned about the efficacy of their data, they can still leverage ML by using supervised learning models, unsupervised learning models. Unsupervised algorithms do not need to be trained with desired outcome data. Instead, they can use effectively an iterative approach to review data and arrive at conclusions. Unsupervised learning algorithms can be more complex in that they learn using historical data that doesn't include classifications of past human decisions about that data. What this means is that the algorithm learns on its own how to make a decision rather than learning from how humans have made similar decisions in the past. The processes in general involved in machine learning are similar to that of data mining and predictive modeling. Both require searching through data to look for patterns and making determinations based on those patterns. Many people are familiar with machine learning in their day-to-day lives, from shopping on the internet and being served ads related to their purchase, which happens because recommendation engines use machine learning to personalize online ad delivery in almost real time. Beyond personalized marketing, other common machine learning use cases include things such as fraud detection. In the IT space, you have things such as email spam filtering. You also have network security threat detection, things like predictive maintenance, where you can make predictions about failures of equipment even before it happens, and even things when you go online and browse social media with things like predictive building news feeds and recommendations about what you would be interested in. So now we'll talk through computer vision. Computer vision, sometimes called CV, gives an algorithm eyes to perceive and interpret visual and text-based imagery. An algorithm can use computer vision to interpret a PDF or a scanned fax document to extract the meaning from that data. For example, using computer vision, an algorithm could look at a fax and, based on training protocols, learn to identify which sections on the page contain things such as a patient's first or last name. So finally, we'll talk about entity extraction, also known as named entity recognition. Entity extraction, which is a natural language processing technique, refers to the process of identifying and classifying key elements from text into predefined categories. In this way, it helps transform unstructured or free-form data into structured data, and therefore makes the data machine-readable and available for standard processing, which can be applied to retrieving information, extracting facts, and answering questions. So let's look at the process of entity extraction and how it works. So in certain formats, such as document files, spreadsheets, web pages, and social media, data often appears unstructured. Being able to identify entities within that, and entities would be things such as people, places, organizations, even numerical expressions such as dates and times, all provides a way for anyone who must make use of that information to effectively understand what it contains. Whether the person is an analyst who has hundreds of documents to review, or an investigative journalist who has just received a large data dump, they may not initially know what the information contains, but through entity extraction, it can show what they're looking for. So in general, it is through the use of AI techniques such as ML, CV, or entity recognition that RPA becomes more than just rules-based automation. In effect, RPA becomes a way of leveraging AI-based decision-making throughout an organization. Now that we've talked through the different kinds of automation, let's take a look at how they can be put into practice within your organization. Even though we talked about each kind of automation working in isolation, it's important to realize that many workflows and tasks require several capabilities at once. I'll give you real-life examples, or actually I'll give you two real-life examples of how AI is optimizing different workflows. First, we'll use automating prescription prior authorizations as an example. To automate a prescription prior auth, Olive may need to use RPA, computer vision, and machine learning to mimic a human's behavior. She would do this by going through the following steps. First, a new prescription order is faxed to a pharmacy. Then, Olive leverages machine intelligence to classify fax type, then uses computer vision to understand and extract the relevant data from that fax. After that, Olive would route the prescription through the appropriate prior authorization portal. From there, Olive writes the determination back to the designated location and alerts any necessary staff of the determination. For workflows like PPAs that require both reading and making sense of a document, computer vision and machine learning will work hand in hand to help the automation truly mimic human behavior. So a second example of a workflow that might use multiple types of information is insurance subrogation. The insurance subrogation process illustrates the need for machine learning in a workflow. So the workflow looks like this. First, access a list of patients who have been impacted by an accident for which they are not at fault. Next, access each patient's medical history. From there, Olive evaluates the history to determine which medical incidents, whether it's appointments, prescriptions, or treatments, were actually related to the accident. Finally, report back the related incidents to be charged to the at-fault party's insurance provider. So for step 3 of this workflow, a machine learning model is trained using historical data to help Olive learn how to identify both related and unrelated incidents. As Olive processes the information in a medical incident, she is able to access the model and make it a determination of the incident's relevancy based on previous historical determinations. So insurance subrogation demonstrates how in use cases that require human-like decision-making, machine learning can be a necessary part of automating a workflow. For example, workflows that involve evaluating a set of data to take subsequent steps depending on context require a machine learning model to take the appropriate actions. We just talked through the different technical components that could go into a certain workflow. But to put it all in perspective, let's go and watch a quick video to show how Olive can specifically tackle the case of eligibility checks. Since each workflow can involve multiple types of automation, whether rules-based or judgment-based, or both, it's important to deeply understand the different components and be able to see them at work within a workflow, to see how automation can help optimize that workflow. So what we're going to do, to test your knowledge, we've got a quick 2-question quiz for you on the next slide. All right. First question, which of these is not a type of judgment-based automation? Computer vision, entity extraction, robotic process automation, or unsupervised machine learning? Great. So for those of you who answered C, robotic process automation, you are correct. Robotic process automation is considered a kind of rule-based automation, which means it's rule-based, process-driven, and will be performed the same way every time. Computer vision, entity extraction, and unsupervised machine learning are all types of artificial intelligence, which is used for judgment-based automation. So we'll go ahead and go on to the next question. When an algorithm learns on its own how to make a decision using a data set, this is called supervised learning, structured learning, unstructured learning, or unsupervised learning. So the correct answer for this one is D, unsupervised learning. Supervised and unsupervised learning are the two different types of machine learning, where supervised learning learns right from wrong by analyzing how humans handle similar data, whereas unsupervised learning, on the other hand, draws its relationships from a data set without analyzing human conclusions that were drawn from similar data. So now that you've got a foundation for automation technologies and what they entail, let's talk about how you can start putting them into place within your organization. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Rebecca.
Thanks, David. David, you gave a nice overview of what artificial intelligence entails and how it works. Now I'll transition into some of the business and implementation questions that surround artificial intelligence within the context of workflow automation. One of the most common questions we get at Olive is around knowing which workflows are good candidates for automation. It's one that's critical to answer correctly, and one that we've been able to navigate given our work across so many different health systems. As we went through those discussions and deployments, we saw an opportunity to craft a methodology to explain to organizations how and where to get started. At a high level, the best candidates for automation are tasks that are repetitive and high volume and are done in a similar way every time, repeatability, if you will. That likely makes sense to most of you. What's interesting is that we find tasks that meet these criteria are also often more prone to human error. So the value of automation is not just conducting the task faster, but also more effectively each and every time. The top workflows that Olive has been hired to do in revenue cycle are eligibility checking, claim status updates, and procedural prior auth. But if those workflows don't jump out to you as problematic, don't worry. You can take one of two approaches to start revealing ideal workflows for your organization in a straightforward way. First, you could take a problem-oriented approach. Ask yourself, what are the big problems standing in your way? Do you feel like there are bottlenecks in your collection process? Or is your prior auth process particularly labor-intensive? Where are the bulk of your employees spending their time? Where do you find that your employees have to interface with lots of systems to get their work done? If you see something you want to fix, you can start then diving into the different workflows that are associated with that task. What processes does your organization go through in order to submit a prior authorization, for example? Once you've identified the bottleneck that's holding back your organization, then you can start diving into the components of that bottleneck and figure out which component would be best to automate. If, however, you don't see a problem that's standing out in your organization, instead you could take a solution-oriented approach. Ask yourself, what are the strategic goals within your organization? What KPIs are you tracking, and which ones have the most impact potential? Maybe you have certain metrics you're trying to reach, or maybe your goals are higher levels. Maybe you want to improve the speed of your collections, or to reduce turnover and burnout, or lower denials for no coverage. Once you've selected some solutions you and your team want to work towards, you can then begin to identify which workflows can help you meet those goals. For example, if you want to improve the speed of your collections, you might want to focus on workflows that contribute to that, such as patient insurance verification and claim status updates. Even though this webinar particularly focuses along the revenue cycle, it's important to note that automation technologies and AI generally can have impact within most, if not all, functions of the hospital where high-volume administrative tasks are done, including supply chain, order management, informatics, and these two approaches to identifying which workflows to automate will work in those functions as well. So now, by looking at your organization from a problem-oriented and solution-oriented lens, you should be able to generate a laundry list of workflows you could automate. But how do you decide on which ones to focus first? Many of our customers have embraced Olive quickly and holistically, and some have come up with dozens of business processes they want Olive to take over in a matter of weeks. To handle the influx of business processes, we developed a methodology to help prioritize and roadmap these CPAs, or candidate processes for automation. Our methodology, called the SHAPE methodology, stands for Scaling Humans with Advanced Process Engineering. It helps organizations not just prioritize, but also quantify, qualify, as well as track candidate processes for automation. So how do you implement the SHAPE methodology? First, you want to start with your laundry list of candidate processes for automation, which, like I said before, we call CPAs. From there, you'll create a simple assessment so you can compare workflows against one another in an easy-to-understand way. We assess each CPA against impact, which is measured in 3 components, and speed, which is assessed against 2. For impact, which we scale on a scale of 1 to 4, it looks at human hours required for the workflow, error vulnerability, and its potential to increase revenue and profit. On the speed element, we look at actionability and volume per day, again on a relative scale of 1 to 4. Once you've listed all of your CPAs in this process, you can begin to plot each CPA on a coordinate graph that measures the impact of the automation versus the speed it will take to achieve that impact. In our approach, we measure the y-coordinate by taking the sum of the first 3 numbers in your CPA, and we measure the x-coordinate by taking the sum of the last 2 numbers in your CPA. So when you map out those, you can begin to visualize which ones are most impactful and most time efficient to implement. You can do this by splitting up your graph into 4 quadrants. Points in the upper right quadrant, quadrant QA, are high in speed and high in impact, so are always prioritized first. Conversely, points in the lower left quadrant, quadrant QD, are lower in speed and impact and should be considered last. Between quadrants QB and QC, it really depends on your organization's priorities. Do you care more about long-term impact, or are you looking for some quick wins? Oftentimes, organizations that are new to Olive, or new to automation in general, choose speed over impact in order to get traction throughout the enterprise, and then they over-prioritize impact once significant traction is achieved. This framework can help you point you in the right direction about which automations to focus on. An emerging alternative to using a methodology like this is to leverage a process mining technology. This technology passively monitors your employees to determine bottlenecks and opportunities for optimization. These technologies track every mouse movement and every keystroke in order to understand how workflows should function and where opportunities lie for improvement. At Olive, we're building our own process mining tool called Pupil to help our client organizations determine which workflows would be most impactful to them. We believe this offers the opportunity to both be more scientific because it's actual process workflow and autonomous. It doesn't require people to map out the process or the system interactions. These 2 impacts, we believe, will fundamentally change the trajectory of artificial intelligence in RPA. It's time for another quiz. Which of these would not be considered a good criterion for determining a candidate for automation? A, it's high volume. B, highly customized. C, repetitive. Or D, it's prone to human error. The correct answer here is B, highly customized. We tend to advise looking for workflows that are high volume, repetitive, and prone to human error because those demonstrate the greatest ROI with automation. Another rule of thumb is that rule-based workflows are also good candidates for automation. Next question, looking at the graph below, which CPA would be considered the best based on the SHAPE methodology? If you guessed 001, you're right. The SHAPE methodology basically quantifies CPAs based on speed and impact, and coordinate 001 ranks the highest for each of these metrics. You can tell this because 001 is located in the upper right-hand quadrant. Once you've now come up with a list of CPAs and have begun to model out the value that automation can bring to your organization, it's time to decide how to implement AI at your organization. One thing we often hear from healthcare organizations of all sizes is that they don't necessarily know what would be most advantageous for their organization. Buying a platform to build their own bots, or purchasing AI as a service, which at its core is a way to purchase an AI workflow without having to piece together all the complexities yourself, the platform, the database, the servers, the security, the consultants. AI as a service is a way to rent or hire the final product. While the right solution will depend on your organization's sophistication, needs, and appetite for speed, we do have some suggestions that can help you navigate that discussion as you move forward in your automation journey. The first question is, where does automation fit within your core competencies? For example, if we're talking about a revenue cycle automation or artificial intelligence, while it does help your organization compete and survive, likely building artificial intelligence and workflow automation isn't your core competency. We do have some customers where workflow automation is an enterprise strategic function, and while those appear to be the exception, those are good environments for platform purchases versus AI as a service. The second question is, how much would it cost? There's various business models out there. The vast majority of historical solutions have been delivered in a consulting type fashion, time and materials for the length of the project. Then once the project is on run, the team's likely available in a maintenance retainer. It's important to take an all-in view of the costs, including the value of internal costs to support and troubleshoot. The third question is, how long will it take? In a major health system, you might have an entire IT team with the bandwidth to build your automations from the ground up in just as much time as it would take an external vendor. In most organizations, though, an external team has the resources and the scale to deploy much more quickly. Finally, you'll want to ask, what level of expertise do I have on my team? And do I have sufficient knowledge to build what I want in-house? Again, this is typically more feasible for a large health system that has access to a dedicated IT team for their business problems. Consider the answers to each of these questions and ask yourself which questions are most important to you. Having a decision matrix built out to weigh your options will help you make a more strategic choice and will also help other members of your team align on your decision. In order to have a comprehensive view of what your automation project could look like, you'll likely want to talk to several AI solution providers. When you're evaluating a vendor, make sure you do thorough research, because not doing your homework could result in a subpar automation workflow, broken process, decreased ROI, or even compromised data. We always suggest that organizations start out by casting a wide net, doing your own research as well as asking colleagues for their recommendations. As you know, referrals are incredibly powerful, so be sure to ask around, but also ask for negative experiences and feedback that vendors may not always offer up on their own. Once you've got a list of vendors to contact, start reaching out. In your conversations, you'll want to identify the things we mentioned before, the company's expertise, their implementation time, and their cost. Expertise is sometimes the hardest element to assess, so we suggest that organizations ask vendors for case studies and testimonials, and always do customer references. You'll also want to make sure that the vendors you solicit aren't just experts in RPA or AI, but they're experts in healthcare RPA or healthcare AI. As many of us who have grown up in the healthcare industry can attest, there are unique aspects of healthcare that aren't necessarily seen in other industries. You want to use an ERP for your EMR, so don't use a generic RPA tool to build a healthcare bot. Once you have several vendors to consider, you can start assessing which option best fits your needs. When building out your decision matrix, it doesn't have to be complex. Just a table that plots your criteria versus each vendor you're soliciting. If you're looking at a total of 5 options, you can go across and rank each vendor 1 to 5 for each criterion, with 1 being the best and 5 being the worst. Then tally up the totals to see who stacks highest based on your priorities. If you look at the example on the slide here, you can see based on our decision matrix that company 1 would be the highest value, while company 3 would be the lowest. If one criterion is more important than the others, though, say that cost is your ultimate influencing factor, you can weight it more heavily by multiplying it by a factor of 2, 3. Most important is that you and your organization put together a comprehensive plan by which you can assess different automation solutions and decide which is the right fit for your organization. So you've now selected your automation vendor and built a solution for your workflow. But how do you turn that into dollars and cents? How do you illustrate to your organization the value of the solution? In our final section, we'll talk through strategies you can use to maximize the potential of an automation in financial terms so that you can ensure you're maximizing ROI and meeting your expectations. When assessing the ROI of an automation, you can start by quantifying the metrics that were measured on the 1 to 4 scale in the CPA process I described earlier. Just as a refresher, those metrics include human hours required, error vulnerability, potential to increase revenue profit, actionability, and volume per day. There are additional ways to measure and demonstrate business value, including 1, speed. How long do these high-volume repetitive CPAs take today? How long could they take with the assistance of, or when done completely by, RPA technology? 2, productivity. Ask yourself, how many times can your team get through a given task today? How many could they get through with the help of RPA? Accuracy. What % of tasks are incorrectly completed today? What does that cost you every year? And then opportunity cost. What could your team be working on instead of what they're working on today? How much more revenue potential, cost savings, or patient satisfaction could that bring in for your organization? Your ROI calculations, at least initially, will be based on data and projections provided by the automation vendors you're talking with. It's important to note that each workflow and use case is different, so your vendor is likely estimating based on historical data. Ask them to provide use cases and historical ROI examples to give some context to the ROI figures they project for your workflow. Even if these numbers are likely to change for your organization, at least it will help you frame the potential impact. Like we talked about before, many workflows won't just involve RPA, but can involve a combination of RPA, artificial intelligence, and computer vision. Well, the same thing is true of ROI. When you're looking at how your CPAs function today, your team might be taking more time than it would if the process were automated, but your team might also be making more mistakes. Because of this, it's important to consider a multidimensional approach to ROI and ask yourself all the different ways that ROI can be generated for your given CPA. Then, when you're armed with this, you can approach the rest of your team with the benefits of automation and show how it will benefit everyone. Now that we've discussed how to identify candidates for automation, vet them, and gauge ROI, I'd like to wrap up by showing what this can look like when put into practice. One of Olive's customers, Heart of Ohio Family Health Centers, is a 17-exam room clinic that serves high-risk and underserved communities. When we first started working with them, Heart of Ohio had 6 full-time associates who were in charge of everything from greeting patients to scheduling and running eligibility checks. As the clinic was seeing upwards of 200 patients per day, you can imagine how difficult it was for 6 people to juggle all those tasks on a day-to-day basis. Today, Olive has taken over eligibility checks for the entire Heart of Ohio team and is able to successfully complete eligibility checks for 90% of their day patients each day, leaving only 10% for further review by staff. Thanks to Olive, eligibility checks now take only 1 back office staff member 30 minutes per day, compared to the 6 full-time employees who spend over 2 hours each day on the same task. Because Heart of Ohio was able to save so much bandwidth, the company's front desk associates were trained on data collection requirements for their unique reporting, which helps them report and display their unique accomplishments. Another one of our customers, Hancock Regional, also used Olive to manage eligibility checks in their hospital in Greenfield, Indiana. Back in 2016, Hancock's bad debt to account receivable ratio was over 87%. And most billers would simply wait 45 to 60 days to see if a denial came back and then work to reconcile any information that caused a denial. Because the team was waiting that long, it was pushing the company's days in AR higher than they wanted it to be. Now, Olive goes in every day and compares the previous day's registrations against Eligibility Portal, then notifies the billing team of any action items that need to be taken care of. As a result, Olive has already reduced their days in accounts receivable by 14%, and she's on track to reduce it by 29% by the end of the year. Hopefully, this gives you a better understanding of how not just ROI can be calculated on paper, but what sort of impact it can have in organizations like yours. Now we'll wrap up with one last check for understanding and then open the floor to questions. According to the SHAPE methodology, which of these metrics would not be quantified in order to establish ROI of an automation? Productivity, opportunity cost, accuracy, or employee satisfaction? The correct answer here is D, employee satisfaction. Even though employee satisfaction is highly important and is something that we often see automation improve, the purpose of the SHAPE methodology is to compare CPAs based on speed and impact. The ways to do this are through measuring speed, productivity, opportunity cost, and accuracy. That said, as you're establishing ROI, you should look at how employee satisfaction affects these other metrics. That concludes our structured programming for today's webinar. With that, I think we are ready to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Rebecca and David, for that fantastic presentation. We will now begin today's question and answer session. Please submit any questions you have by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We will try to get through as many questions as we have time for. Our first question is, what is the right size institution where you see AI being deployed?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that we've necessarily seen a, quote, right-size institution. We've worked with 25-bed hospitals up to some of the nation's largest health systems. What I would suggest is more important is to look at volume and verify that there is sufficient volume on that workflow to create a good return for an organization. So when we think about, right-sizing automation, we often use a rule of thumb that advises to look for workflows that currently take up about 2 FTEs time. And so you can see that transcends small organizations to large organizations. And that tends to be our rule of thumb for thinking about where the size of a workflow that would generate a significant return on an automation. Good question.
Thanks so much for going over that. This next audience member asks, what are some prerequisites we need to do before automating workflows?
Oh, I love that question. We don't get that one enough, actually. So I think there's a couple of things that I would say help an organization prep for automation. The first is prioritize. This is actually one of the hardest things that we've observed is, where do you even start on your journey of automation? I think the SHAPE methodology, while it's simple, I think that's actually part of its power. It gives a real accessible framework to think about where do I start. So I would suggest use some methodology similar to that to help prioritize. Without doing that type of kind of pre-work, it can be overwhelming once you start talking with solution providers. And what we've seen is there's a temptation to automate everything at once instead of prioritizing what matters most to an organization. So first, I would say prioritize. Secondly, I would say education. And that's really within the organization. So it's important to make sure organizations understand what the goals are and how you're measuring success. And so keeping lines of communication open with all the stakeholders early in the process can make it a bit easier to bring on additional champions without feeling necessarily distrustful or concerned around the technology. And then lastly, I think there's something around preparation. So any documentation or process mapping that you have or that you use with your current team for onboarding new employees is going to be exceptionally helpful. Typically, the more documentation, the better. So because how that works is automation vendors will use this to essentially train the algorithm, just like you would bring on a new employee. And so not having this documentation can slow the process. And so it makes it a lot more efficient. So if I had to leave with 3 things, I would probably say prioritize where you want to focus. Start understanding kind of the thinking of the organization around perceptions around automation, and then start prepping from a documentation perspective.
Those are some really great points. Thanks so much. We now have an audience member who would like clarification on cost. So how much does it cost to implement automation?
You know, and that is, unfortunately, the question, the answer is often, you know, the ever-hated answer of it depends. But there's a lot of factors that go into it, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, and then I can try and size it a bit. So some of the factors go into it is which are the processes you're doing that automate. You know, David did a nice job talking about all the building blocks of artificial intelligence being CV, ML, entity extraction. So it really depends on how complex the workflow is, and then what do you need to bring up? So what do you need to use within artificial intelligence? It also depends on the volume. So is this automating, you know, X, 2X, 3X transactions a day? Well, again, and this gets back to a little bit to the earlier questions, when we're talking with the marketplace, we tend to advise that focus on a workflow that takes up 2 FTEs time, or, you know, rule of thumb costs about $80,000 in terms of staff time, lost opportunity, benefits, et cetera. And then those numbers to us start thinking, okay, you're putting enough resources in this workflow to have a good ROI. And then every solution is going to have a slightly different answer, but I think at that level of cost spending, you should very much expect that you will cut your costs in half. And so if I did that without knowing anything else, an $80,000 workflow, pay $40,000 for it, save $40,000. And that, I would say, is easy math, and what we often see is that the ROI is probably more in the 3 to 4 to 5x of that. So a lot of talking around it. That's probably about how the best answer I can give without more specifics on how much does it cost to implement.
Definitely, that's really helpful to understand. Our next question is, what areas of the hospital are most ripe for automation?
You know, so I think we look at this 2 ways, both clinical opportunities and administrative opportunities. And a lot of the press and what you see in the market right now around AI is focused in the clinical space, things like diagnostic support, imaging support. Clearly, our focus has been on the administrative side, just because we see that as one of the easiest ways to cut down on unnecessary spend and drive down the cost of healthcare. Having said that, there really aren't any areas of healthcare that we would say couldn't be innovated further. So I would say, again, go back to the methodology around prioritizing the speed and the impact of the workflow. Focus in one area. Obviously, the focus of today's conversation is around revenue cycle, and I think we have seen in our time in the marketplace that that's a very fertile area for artificial intelligence for a number of characteristics. And so we have said that. I also mentioned supply chain, another great area within the hospital where it's very ripe for automation.
Great, thanks so much for going over that. This next audience member asks, what IT requirements do we need in order to automate tasks in our hospital?
I'm going to ask David to take that one.
Yeah, that's a great question. Once again, I think the simple answer is that it depends, but it depends on a couple things that we like to figure out from the hospital to start with. So first off, it really is dependent upon the volume of the workflow that you have. So trying to understand really the amount of human effort that would have gone into it has a direct impact on kind of the amount of IT resources that you would need. Aside from that, really when we come in, what we actually ask for is we come in and we say we would like a workstation which matches kind of the workstation that a employee would use to do that same job. And from an IT perspective, what this means is they're used to spinning up machines for employees. So you can get around some of the conversations. It doesn't feel like a vendor engagement so much. With all of that said, what I would say, get your IT team involved early on in the process. Get the security process going from the outset, and really get those people engaged, because what you'll find is that RPA is not kind of a thing they're used to thinking of. It doesn't fit within traditional vendor relationships that they may be used to. So kind of exploring that at the outset with an RPA vendor is a very valuable thing to do as well.
Thanks for that great question and informative response. Our next question has to do with RPA. So how does RPA differ from scripting or screen scraping?
This is another great question. From this perspective, actually, I just mentioned getting your IT team involved, and this is actually one case and where this is valuable. So what you may hear from some of your IT team is they may have had a history in what they'll call screen scraping. And automating systems is not something that's intrinsically new. What RPA has done is it's based on a legacy of some of these kind of screen scraping technologies and effectively taken it to a new level, whereas screen scraping traditionally was based on things like coordinates on the screen, simple kind of lookups against the screen. And what it created a reality where a lot of that stuff was very brittle. So people had historically got burned by this idea that they would implement something and then it would break quickly. A lot of what RPA brings to the table is an evolution of that to answer some of those questions. So for example, RPA is big on validating. So after Olive takes an action, for example, Olive then goes and looks and says, is the system in a state where I would expect it to be? Have I achieved what I had set out to achieve? So there's a lot of validation through the process. And that's built on top of a lot of the things we kind of talked about earlier. So we talked about kind of machine learning and computer vision specifically. Olive actually uses those as a part of the validation process to get around some of that kind of traditional brittle thought process that plagued screen scraping back in the day.
Thanks so much for clarifying that. This next audience member asks, once I have a list of tasks that I want to automate, how do I determine which kinds of automation would be best suited to optimize it?
So this is Rebecca, I can take that one. I think there's a two-pronged approach to that. One hand, you want to go through kind of the different components of the workflow and understand what goes into this step. For example, if we go back to the insurance subrogation example we talked about earlier, in that one, Olive started by accessing a list of patients who had some kind of accident. Okay, is that task done the same way each and every time? Yes. Does she need to see anything on the screen to accomplish that step? No. So in that case, you can probably guess that RPA could accomplish this first step. So that's one way you go through each step by step and keep asking yourself these questions. But quite honestly, that's what a good partner should help you. A little bit is you don't need to know necessarily how the sausage is made. You just the point you as the revenue cycle executive just need to understand the business problem you're trying to accomplish. So I would say I don't know that you need to solve for that. You probably just want to be well versed enough to know that there are different forms, and then ask fact-finding questions about trade-offs between each of those.
Thanks so much for going over that. Our next question is, how will automation affect my team? Should we plan on reducing our staff if we implement automations or AI?
Oh, that is a good one. And we get that one actually a lot. And I would tell you, I find that one to be a bit more provocative than practical. But what I would say is that workforce displacement doesn't have to be an issue unless you want it to be. What we usually tell people is we're not trying to replace humans. We're just trying to replace what humans are doing that they shouldn't need to do. So we've had some organizations come to us and say we have a strategic goal that we need to cut our administrative costs, and Olive, our automation, can help do that. But more often we see organizations who want to use the team they already have in place and just use them in a smarter way.
Thanks for pointing that out. It looks like we have time for one more question. Our last question is, are there any potential drawbacks to using AI or other automations in a hospital? Thinking about the news that recently came out about IBM Watson.
Yeah, that is definitely a good question. I think part of going into the process is really understanding the data and what you're hoping to get out of it. So one of the things, we spend a lot of time talking about machine learning. It's kind of important to understand that a machine learning process, especially one trained on historical data, can only ever be as good as the people were doing it before. So it's inherent that within your organization, you're going to have misclassified data, you're going to have people making mistakes. And so understanding where those existed in your workflow prior to trying to automate it. One of the other things we've seen too is really sometimes making sure that you actually even understand the workflow as it exists. We found a lot of times that at some of these healthcare organizations we've seen that the workflow they're doing actually, there's very simple ways to improve it even prior to automation effectively.
Thanks so much for going over that. Squeezing in one last question here before we close out. Our last question is, what incremental value would you expect to see from a healthcare-only RPA company?
Great question. So one of the things, probably the core thing that I would point out is a team with healthcare-specific domain knowledge. So as I mentioned, you kind of want a partner, not someone who's just going to come in and look at what you're currently doing and build an RPA automation around it. You want someone who can help guide and help figure out kind of the best approach and even sometimes the best opportunities within the hospital. And all of that comes from domain knowledge. We've done enough eligibility-related workflows, for example, that sometimes we can come into an organization and we can have a conversation about opportunities to improve their processes that they may not have even thought of. But all of that comes from kind of our historical background on having done this for others. I think some other things that are kind of core to keep in mind is Olive specifically, we have this concept of aptitudes. And so the whole idea with an aptitude is taking a lot of healthcare-specific technologies, healthcare-specific integrations, and actually making them first-class citizens within an RPA platform. So whereas a lot of RPA is really around automating kind of against the user experience, if HL7 exists, if FHIR interfaces exist, why not use those if they're the best approach to achieving a job? And so with all of what we really focused on is creating aptitudes for everything from, like I mentioned, HL7 and FHIR, all the way to data lookups against Centers for Medicaid, for example, or looking up ICD codes to put into a workflow. And the final thing I'd say on that topic is we basically, focusing on the healthcare domain, it allows us to build up kind of reusable workflow components. So the idea, if I've seen a process in an EHR like a patient lookup, I have an intrinsic knowledge around that, and I can build out that process and then reuse it again and again, not necessarily having to build that process from the ground up.
That is all the time we have for today, but I want to thank Rebecca and David for their excellent presentation and Olive for sponsoring today's webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.